Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Leah Trushanecki. I am the Principal Product Marketing Manager covering our cloud solutions here at Veeam. And I'm joined today by my friend Corinne Bissett, a technologist on the Office of the CTO team. Corinne, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, well, that was a fantastic introduction to start with. I'm super excited to be here. I know we get asked about cloud a lot because we tend to be leaning towards the cloud experts in our organization.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely have had a lot of action, especially this quarter. We've had a lot of really great events. I just had the great pleasure of attending Microsoft Ignite and AWS reInvent, which means that I brought back a lovely cold back from one of those trips. So everyone can hopefully bear with me as I kind of bust through my very gravelly, raspy voice today. But with that, we do want to talk about a different kind of threat than just the common cold. We want to specifically talk about cybersecurity threats. And that's because here at Veeam during Q4, during this final part of 2023, heading into 2024, we've really all wanted to rally around various cybersecurity stories here at Veeam. And of course, as two of our cloud experts, me and Corinne wanted to spend time talking more about cloud resiliency and really illuminate for our Veeam community some of the things you should be thinking about heading into 2024 when it comes to data living in the cloud and some best practices and ways that Veeam can help so that you can stay resilient with some really basic steps. So to do that, Corinne, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about kind of the threat landscape and some of the things that we've been talking about as a Veeam team as we've been looking at, what needs to get protected and what is the kind of threat that's happening out there. So why don't we go ahead and flip to the next slide and take a look at this data from our ransomware trends report. Now, if you guys haven't had a chance to take a look at the ransomware trends report from 2023, this was a report that we launched around VeeamON back in May. And there's tons of great data points. But of course, as the cloud experts here, we really were honing in on two key data points. The first was what types of systems were targeted by the cyber attack. Now, the preceding question of this, of course, was, did you have a ransomware attack that affected your environments? And then the next question was, what types of systems were targeted? 30% of respondents who said, yes, we had a ransomware attack, noted that their cloud hosted workloads were attacked. Now, I think there's kind of a general perception in perhaps cloud communities, but even non-cloud communities, that because the cloud is a high availability architecture, that it must be resilient, right? And I think this data shows that actually a lot of these bad actors are really seeing cloud hosted workloads as a great opportunity to target very critical applications. So many organizations now have a cloud first approach. So as tier one applications or even DevOps are being built in the cloud, they're finding it's a great opportunity to go attack where it's going to hurt. And of course, when those attacks do happen, we then ask the follow-up question, what percentage of each type of production platform were affected by your ransomware attack? And for cloud hosted workloads specifically, our respondents noted that at least some of the data, right? 23% said small amount of data, 22% said roughly half, 26% said most of the data was successfully affected. So that means that this can really be a very catastrophic experience for organizations and something that they need to be thinking about when it comes to their overall resiliency strategy. It can't just be about making sure that VMware workloads are recoverable or edge workloads are protected with cybersecurity software. We have to really be thinking about recovery of the worst case scenario. So Corinne, anything you want to add before we kind of talk about some basics that the community should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think this is a conversation that we've consistently had over time. It's always just been a different kind of platform. It's this idea behind protection behind obscurity, which is not real protection. We had this conversation when Macs started to show up in the world, and I was like, okay, these Macs are super secure, or they're obscure from the generally created attack system and vectors out there. Then we ran into Linux, we ran into cell phones, we ran into pretty much every platform as it first comes into a marketplace, or when it starts to get adopted into business marketplaces, you start to see this, okay, you don't need protection because this is everything that you're going to need. This is your magic bullet. But that is definitely not the case. Everything that has access to the internet at one point in time is going to become a vulnerability in your infrastructure and creating layers behind that. And we see that no matter what technology comes through. Now,
Yeah,
we have this,
go
yeah.
ahead. Sorry.
Do you have anything else for this slide?
No, I think I was going to transition over to some of those basics we wanted to talk about. So it's perfect.
Perfect. So the
Yeah.
3-2-1 rule is actually something I had no idea what this was until I came to work for our backup company. And it became this concept of how are we going to implement this? What is the perfect rule? And how do we make sure we have resiliency, redundancy, and a quote unquote impervious to impenetrate kind of backup system? And there's really no right answer for every organization, but there are some pretty common standards around the 3-2-1 rule. And that's what we decided to kind of organize in a way that makes sense to cloud infrastructures. But the basis of the 3-2-1 rule is to make sure that you have at least 3 copies of your data. So, say you have something on prem, you have some copy that may be a storage snapshot, and then you have something that you send off to a secondary site. That could be 3 different copies of your data, at least 2 different media types. If you're still a tape infrastructure, tape is a great media type. You have object storage, which is the new shiny objects that we're working with. And then offsite. Offsite and immutable, making sure you have some type of gap between your production data and your secondary data, whether it's logical or physical, becomes so important today. And did you have something to add to that one, Leah?
Well, I think we spent a lot of time talking about the 3-2-1 rule. And while it may seem like a basic, and I think Corinne's experience of, oh, I'd never heard of this before, but gosh, this makes sense. It's one we hear a lot about. But I think what's really interesting, having spent a lot of time with, Azure engineers and AWS architects, especially at those events I was just at, they don't know these basics of backup. They don't know some of these common rules of thumb and principles. And so, as those of us who have spent a lot of time in backup, and certainly all of you as a Beam community, we have a real opportunity to share a lot of these best practices with our colleagues who are in, database, who are in modern work teams managing Microsoft 365. These are basics that work for any kind of workload, regardless of where the data resides. So I think it's super helpful to really internalize them, but also share this. However, it's very important to understand how this rule gets adapted for different kinds of workloads. So Corinne, I think we wanted to kind of expand this 3-2-1 rule on the next slide and talk a little bit about how this could be done with cloud workloads. Because, when we're thinking about something like 2 different kinds of media, normally we're thinking about, as Corinne said, a server and tape, for example. But in the cloud, you can do something similar, right? The way that our Veeam solutions work, but even how AWS and Azure's own solutions work for backup, is you initially take a snapshot, right? And those of us who work in servers, we're all too familiar with snapshots. But what we want to be able to do, and this is what Veeam uniquely does, is create a backup from that snapshot that can then be portable. And that can move into something like object storage, which is not only more cost effective, but it is a different kind of media. And therefore, you can do other things with it, like turn on immutability. We're also going to talk a bit today about cross cloud backup and how easy it can be. And easy is a general word. Of course, there's always ingress and egress fees and those kinds of things that apply. But it really within Veeam can be easy to take that portable backup and move it to different locations. Anything you want to add, Corinne?
I think the biggest thing to add here is that we're not throwing the 3-2-1 rule out the window at all. We're adopting and moderating this for the new world. So we don't think of physical gaps like we have a removable hard drive. We don't have those removable tapes we send off to Iron Mountain anymore. But that doesn't mean that we can't develop secure backup methods like sending things to an object locked type of repository or third party providers that have 4i rules and extra redundancy on the back end. We have so many service providers that already know the policies in different organizations, different industry regulations, and are already certified to be compliant in a lot of these additives that I can't stress enough that service providers are a great addition to this 3-2-1 and configuration in your infrastructure.
Definitely. And I think the time is really now to have these kinds of conversations within your teams because, as Corinne's showing on this screen, is another data point that we have from our research set. Ransomware is a true disaster. When we did our data protection trends report, and we actually have a new one coming out next quarter, so stay tuned for that update. But when in this year's version, asked respondents over the past 2 years, what were the most common causes of an outage for your organization? The overwhelming majority said it was a cybersecurity event. And this year, it actually toppled infrastructure and network outage. So that's really interesting to take a look at because this is such a common occurrence now. This is something that storage communities need to be contending with. It's not just something that the security teams are contending with. So really the time is now to start working together as different teams within your IT organization to rally around and find some sort of solution to make sure that you can recover in the event of an attack. So to do that, Corinne, I think we wanted to start with some really basic architecture designs so that we can look at how you might be protecting hybrid and multi-cloud. But to start with, let's talk about how you would protect the cloud workloads themselves. And for every one of your organizations or for any partners out there working with customers, you likely have companies that have either standardized on one cloud, and there's lots of benefits for that. And I know Corinne's going to talk a bit about that. But you might also be in an organization or working with customers who are multi-cloud. It was interesting coming back from AWS reInvent. So many of us who were on the show floor said, wow, this was the first year that I had a lot of questions about Azure, or I had a lot of questions about Google Cloud. And it was really interesting to see how much the perception has really changed to thinking more about multi-cloud. Now, we do have the Q&A open, so if anybody does have questions or thoughts or their own experiences to share as we're walking through some of these scenarios, and again, we're going to get to this demo here real soon, pop us in the chat, what questions you have or what you're thinking about, what you're contending with for 2024, because we definitely want to share more of these best practices. We've all spent a lot of time in the field, and I think we can help each other out here. But to start, let's take a look at what it takes to back up a single cloud. Now, with Veeam, for the last several years, we've put out more new versions of our Veeam backup for public cloud appliances. So today we have appliances for AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. And these are really great solutions that are deployed as images through the respective marketplaces. So as an example, you can go to the Azure marketplace, deploy this appliance, and ultimately you can use it to offer native protection of VMs, databases, file shares. And one of the key things that we really recommend you think about when you're doing that deployment is something that we call logical air gapping or logical separation. So basically, if we're thinking about that 3-2-1 rule of having multiple copies of your data in two different locations, one maybe being off-site, a way that you can implement this is by having different kinds of subscriptions, or in the case of AWS, it would be accounts. So what you would do is you have your production Azure account. You may want to then set up a dedicated backup account. That way it is logically separated. You're creating that air gap between production and your backup. And again, I'm speaking about basics here, and that is on purpose. Everybody who uses Veeam today, you understand this concept, but in the cloud, you have to artificially create it. So spinning up a backup subscription in Azure can be super helpful. You run that Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure appliance. You can see that in the bottom of the diagram there. You run that in the backup subscription. That sits on a VM. And what we then do is create worker VMs that will connect to the different production subscriptions you have. So again, maybe you're running a SQL database, maybe you have a file share. That can then back up to any container of your choice. So you create that initial snapshot, you create that backup then can then go to Azure Blob Hot, Azure Blob Cool, or even Azure Blob Archive. And all along the way, you can turn on immutability in the process, which again makes everything much more secure. So that's some of the basics. Corinne, anything you want to add here? And if you're talking, you're on mute.
So sorry. Absolutely. So just to take this a step further, as we all know, and especially if we're experts already in a lot of these clouds, it takes different levels of service accounts to work with, say, disk storage on virtual machines versus working with SQL databases where you may need in-guest service accounts, and then file storage is a whole nother level of permissions and configurations. By having separate workers that can go to these repository accounts, you can scope the permissions only necessary to do those types of applications. So you don't need to open up extra permissions and cross traffic in your infrastructure that may not be necessary to go from, say, the Azure VMs over to here. So I do have a demo as well if there's nothing else that you have to add on your side, Leah.
No, I think everybody wants to see it. Let's go.
All right. So I already have the Azure Marketplace up, but all I did was search for Veeam. Now, when you search for Veeam, there are going to be several items because we have Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365 in here. We have our Veeam Backup and Replication, our service provider, our new Cirrus offerings, which also comes with your monitoring that you can do within cloud and Microsoft 365 with their insights. Now, all I did in this case was I did the free Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure, but you can also do your bring your own license, and this deploys an instance into the cloud. As soon as you log into this instance with the public IP address generated, it's going to ask you to log in, and it's going to walk you through everything that you need to do in order to first start up. So we got the Get Started tab automatically here. And we add an Azure account that has the appropriate permissions. And what's great is if you don't have an idea of how to deploy a lot of these permissions, you can automatically deploy a minimum permission account right from here in order to get started. Now, it does have to have access to the subscription, and you do have to have some sort of owner or privileged access to generate that account, but then we use service account application IDs to go a step further. Then, of course, configuring the workers, which are all of those data movers we were talking about earlier, and adding a repository. Now, the repository does have special configurations. If you do want to leverage immutability, you will want to enable the immutability on the storage when creating it inside of Azure. After that's done, you get this nice, pretty dashboard, and you can see your failed, your warnings, what types of jobs have already processed. And one of my favorite things that have been added is being able to back up your network configurations. I know myself, I've gone through and done troubleshooting inside of firewalls and all of my virtual connections, adding and removing ports. And then one day I have to change one specific thing and I can't remember what that previous setting was. I can come through here and even see the previous stages of my configuration so I don't have to backtrack so many steps. Azure Files is perfect for if you have any kinds of storage accounts that have files on it and you're not sure how to protect it within the cloud, or you don't want to use the really expensive side-by-side redundancy storage. You can send this to a low-cost object storage, no problem, so you're not spending as much money in your cloud, but you're still getting that same protection. Inside of here, I am actually protecting my Veeam backup for Microsoft 365 that lives inside of Azure with not just a backup policy, but a snapshot policy. And we'll take a look at this policy that I created. Creating a new policy looks exactly the same way. If you have multiple subscriptions, it'll ask you to verify the service account, which regions you would like to put into the scope of this specific policy. So if you have multi-regions, you can have multiple policies based on each of those regions, sending data back to those regions so you're not accruing extra data. Here we have the application aware snapshots. This will allow me to do more of that file level instances inside of Windows. Tags, if I'm going to do snapshots based on that, and I also enabled backups. Now, scheduling is where I get to actually configure those backups, and all of these look very similar whether you want to do a daily, weekly, monthly, or full GFS with yearly. I can do this multiple times a day, multiple times a week, and if you notice, if I select a backup, it'll automatically create me a snapshot up here at the top because the snapshot is where we're pulling all of that data from to get the fastest backup without hurting or doing anything to the production virtual machine. That way you don't have any efficiency issues. Once you've decided all of the settings that you've configured, one of our number one features right here is the cost calculator. The cost calculator will go across the board on each of the machines that you've added in. How much is it going to cost for that snapshot storage? And you can see right here to here, it is significantly more expensive to save snapshots because they're living on that hot data than it is to have a backup that goes to a backup repository. And we even do a calculation on the transaction cost over here for your total column. This will automatically run. You can add multiple machines to this later, or you can create other policies. Now I have a quick look at the AWS side just to show you can also search for Veeam here. And it looks the same because we try to give the same look and feel from across our console so it doesn't feel like you're learning an entirely new software. The only difference might be over in Azure, you're going to have your service accounts. When you're working in AWS, you have the AWS IAMS roles, but everything on the surface level is exactly the same, so you'll have that base consistency. And that's what I had for the environment here.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about hybrid architectures, right? Because I think I mentioned a buzzword earlier, cloud first. And I think some of that perception is actually changing. I hear from a lot of organizations now a cloud right approach where they really want to start to be a little bit more pragmatic about when a workload should reside in the cloud. But overall, I think those approaches imply, hey, we're building a net new workload. Let's put that in the cloud. That makes sense. But when we've done, again, a survey question that we have from our data protection trends report, we oftentimes ask a question of where did this workload that currently lives in the cloud come from? And I don't have that up on the screen here, but I just want to throw this in as color. Um, Overwhelmingly, I think it's about 2/3 of workloads that currently reside in the cloud actually originated as virtual or physical servers living on premises. So the reality is we're seeing so many workloads now moving to the cloud. And what that then does is when we do these kinds of questions of what do you estimate your organization's percentage of servers in each of the following formats currently, and where do you expect them to head, we see 2024 as being more than half of all workloads residing in the cloud. Now, of course, I'm sure if you're a VMware administrator or any other kind of central IT sysadmin kind of role, you're probably looking at this and being like, yeah, but why am I still spinning up new ESXi hosts, or why am I having to continue to buy new servers? And of course, we know that data continues to explode and proliferate, yada, yada, that whole talk track. But I think what we're seeing as an overall trend is that while the on-premises footprint does continue to grow, the cloud footprint is growing at a higher rate. And some of that probably was spurred by COVID. If you look at some of these years, you can see that's probably a pretty decent assumption that as COVID kind of threw apart supply chains and required rapid adoption of new technologies to respond to changes in so many different industries, a lot of data then just needed to go up to the cloud out of necessity. So the new reality is hybrid. So Corinne just showed what it looks like to back up a cloud environment. We, of course, have the on-premises piece that Veeam has been known for so long, being a VMware first company, and then, of course, expanding to Windows Server and Linux and lots of other workloads. So the reality now is organizations are living in hybrid. And we're finding that so many different teams, whether it's database teams, cloud teams, on-prem, et cetera, they tend to kind of do their own backup. We are having a lot of conversations with organizations who want to centralize and want to have real protection of all of their threat surfaces and have the confidence that they can recover based on wherever their data may reside. So, Corinne, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're hearing from the field and how folks are thinking about connecting the cloud piece back into their VBR environment?
Sure. So I see this a lot, and it really comes down to I think everyone's shopping to see what is going to be the most cost efficient when it comes to not just how much does it cost to spin up the server, but what does it cost in man hours to hire the proper expertise. And maybe my application is just not cloud ready. And if the application is not cloud ready, that's a whole nother cost that seems like these hidden costs that crop up, but are starting to be better documented throughout different environments. And I think we'll see a better shift once we have a better lift and shift strategy for all of the mainline work applications that we see out there. But I don't see the data center ever going away in a sense of still having ownership of data and security and compliance. Compliance regulations everywhere are still requiring organizations in some cases to still have copies of that data on their on-premises environment and be able to pull that up as a moment's notice to say, yes, I still own this data. It is within my data center. And regardless if the cloud went offline tomorrow, I could meet compliance. And that brings us to the diagram. So,
So, go ahead.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So I think the hybrid conversation is a really interesting conversation because not a lot of companies, I think, are doing it right. And when I say they're not doing it right, I mean they're having this huge application sprawl between all of these different clouds on your on-premises environment, your cloud environment, and then not knowing that there's different protection levels and different scopes that help integrate and stitch these pieces together. And we start getting all of these protection applications that no one knows how to use. Someone set up once, but it might be 3 or 4 versions changed later because you're not in this every day. And if you're not in this every day, you're then going to miss either updates, create a vulnerability. There's going to be something that could happen like exfiltration, even in cases.
Yeah, I think what's interesting with the whole exfiltration piece is ultimately Veeam can't necessarily answer that element of it, but having the visibility of all of your data, regardless of where it resides, at least helps you better understand what is happening with that data. And so having this kind of hybrid architecture, being able to have data be portable, it makes such a huge difference when we're really thinking about preparedness. And part of that, I think, Corinne, is thinking about cross-cloud backup. How do we leverage resiliency and kind of diversifying the portfolio, if you will, of keeping data in multiple places? Again, if we go back to that golden rule of 3-2-1, the idea of being able to keep your backups in a different location is increasingly more and more appealing to organizations. So if you click that diagram again one more time, Corinne, we can kind of show the folks how, you can already see in the diagram how you can send a backup copy into object storage that might live on-prem. But you may also, and again, we've been having increasingly more conversations about this, you may want to back up to a different cloud altogether. I know, Corinne, you spent a lot of time talking about Microsoft 365. I, at AWS reInvent last week, talked with a lot of folks who do Microsoft 365, but want to back it up to AWS, not just as a way to, use existing contracts that they have with AWS, but philosophically to think about going from the Microsoft cloud into an Amazon cloud. And they really see a lot of inherent resilience with that. And of course, we have a huge network of S3 compatible object storage alliance partners that we work with, that we build these integrations with. And so you're able to even think outside of the hyperscale public clouds and instead send it to somebody like Object First or Wasabi to be able to pull it out completely. Corinne, do you hear a lot about that too on your side?
Absolutely. And I can actually remember the first time that I heard this. And it's when we first started doing object storage inside of Beam Backup for Microsoft 365, or right before we were about to launch that, I sat in a security officer's meeting. The security officer said that it is an absolute requirement for us to go from the Microsoft backbone all the way over to the Azure side. And to me, that didn't make a whole lot of sense because it seemed like we do a lot of effort in moving to a single cloud so we have a single point of reference. But they pointed out something very, very obvious, which is you have a single point of failure. Regardless of that single point of failure supposedly being like a giant, like if that goes down, we might have bigger problems. But that's still a point of contingency for someone that has to make sure if Azure goes offline, if Microsoft 365 goes offline, if AWS goes offline, if GCP goes offline, if your provider goes offline for maintenance, even, will I have access to my data in order to continue business? Will I still be able to do transactions? Am I a hospital and I need to have those patient records because if they're not written down, they're not on the chart, they have no idea about the history. And the different data sets have a much more significant impact on our organization if we lose access, of course, than others. But understanding the business continuity behind being able to back up copy or move data between giants and clouds and giving you that extra level of redundancy, I think has become non-negotiable when moving to the cloud. We give up a lot of control and we need to figure out how to gain that control back.
You know, you touched on a really interesting point, which is this idea of gaining and giving up control and the push and pull of that. I know you and I talk a lot about teaming and how the IT team is now increasingly more and more specialized beyond that sysadmin role. Now you have folks that specialize in containers. You've got folks who specialize, of course, in databases. That's been around for forever. Now we've got these new cloud personas. We've got folks who, again, specialize in modern work applications with Microsoft. And what we're finding in the field is that a lot of folks are building their own backup best practices and their own backup policies, and people are just simply not being on the same page. And I think when it comes to a looming threat like a ransomware attack, that's just not going to get it done anymore. So, Corinne, why don't we go to the next slide and talk a little bit about another data point from another research report that we have called our Cloud Protection Trends Report. So Cloud Protection Trends Report is something that we published about this time last year, but I think the data still stands in that when we surveyed modern work teams, cloud teams, and a few other kind of roles, we asked them two vital questions. The first is, which team or teams within your organization are involved in determining your data protection strategy and requirements for cloud hosted servers? We asked a very similar question about for modern work or Microsoft 365 installations and got very similar results as a result of that. So overwhelmingly, when you look at this data, it seems like the expectation or the goal is to have multiple teams involved. So if there is a team that specializes in backup, which if you're a big enough organization, maybe you do have that team. If you're not, maybe it's just your central IT team. There is an expectation that they are all together working on this regardless of where the data resides. The cloud folks also expect to be involved. However, when you ask the next question, in general, who manages the backup or data protection of cloud hosted servers? Overwhelmingly, the answer is, well, the backup team does that. And what's interesting then is when we actually ask in practice, you know, who is really managing the day to day, it kind of becomes like that Spider-Man meme where the Spider-Mans are all pointing at each other. The backup teams think the cloud guys have it. The cloud guys think the backup teams have it. And in reality, that means nobody probably has it. And so what we're really passionate about here at Veeam is trying to pull these kinds of teams together to avoid some of these, lack of control or over control kind of environments by bringing everybody together into one place. And that's really the promise of the Veeam data platform. So if we flip to the next slide here, this is why, as a product team overall, between product management, product strategy on Corinne's team, and then my team in product marketing, we really love talking about Veeam One, because I think Veeam One is an opportunity for all of the teams to come together and see what's really going on. So as we've built out this architecture, again, thinking about protecting cloud workloads, whether it's VMs, databases, file share, all those PaaS offerings, building in the best practices of the 3-2-1 rule, connecting everything to your VBR server so that you have overall control. That then gives you the ability to connect Veeam One to it. And you can get these at a glance dashboards, you get real-time alerts, you get monthly reporting where maybe as a team, everybody can sit down together and can figure out, is this meeting our expectations? Are there gaps in coverage? Are there more things that we need to do to be successful? And again, stay resilient in the face of something like a ransomware attack. So of course, this is utopia, this is the promised land, this is what we would always hope for, but this is what's possible if you do execute as a team, you do implement all the components of Veeam, and of course, somehow find time for the day two operations that go into reporting and automation and all the great things that we would all love to have time to do. But Corinne, I think that, when we talked about putting this presentation together, those were some elements that we wanted to kind of show off within the Veeam data platform itself, is what does it really look like to see things within VBR, to see things within Veeam One. So do you want to give us a look at some of those elements?
Absolutely. And I'm actually going to do this by pulling up our Veeam backup and replication. This is what we title our flagship product. It's pretty much where all the magic happens in gathering these data points together. And I have a bunch of different resource types that I have added in, and everything from AWS to Azure, and even an on-premises virtualization and agents backup, which is our physical machine. So like if you have laptops, RDM types of connections to machines, this will get all of that data within a backup point. But to get this all going, you can actually configure everything from our backup infrastructure, and that's where you can really see where this data is being pulled from. And I have my vCenter added in. I have my individual machines from those Azure and AWS environments. So those same places that we were looking just earlier, we can even open up the console and take a look. Here's the console, here's all the policies and configurations, and all of my restore points for each of the individual machines in that environment. But we're able to view those from a centralized location. The centralized location allows me not just to see the backups, the external repositories, but the snapshots as well. And for those that are not as familiar with snapshots inside of the cloud environments, snapshots are basically images of full disk virtual machines living on that same production storage side by side. So they have the same restore efficiencies as your production environment, except you're able to roll back if you need to, maybe previous points of files, previous points of virtual machines. You can simply right click on any of the machines from this console for Azure, AWS, or down here when we have the physical agents jobs, those machines to restore back to original locations. We can scan these for phishing kinds of attacks, or excuse me, malware types of attacks or ransomware. We can send them off to air-gapped, cross-load, and cross-compatible types of environments. On top of all of this, we actually even have our Veeam One product. Our Veeam One product is all about monitoring. Inside of here, I not only have my backup and replication, I could add in any NAS I have in my environment and Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365. So I can see the overall health of any of my repositories, how much space is being taken up, how much space Do I have free? And different kinds of capacity reports to see, okay, am I going to run out of space? Let me know if I have 10% left or 20% left in any of these environments. Overarching of all of this, we can take a look at some of these alarms. And if you're not already familiar with our best practice is something that we've implemented so that you can get an idea of how can I be more secure today than I was yesterday. Great example is depreciated versions of SSL or TLS being detected in your environment. Are my backups following the 3-2-1 rule? And it doesn't just tell you something's wrong, it'll actually give you links to all of this documentation on how you can correct this problem. If you need to modify these alarms so that they better meet your environment, you can also do that. And making sure you have email notifications active, meaning you've gone into backup and replication, you've designated a single email or maybe an email group. Anytime a job finishes, anytime an error comes up in that job, maybe it's guest processing, so you're not getting the inside parts of those machines in a way that's very meaningful to your organization. Without just needing to log into this machine directly, we also have our Veeam Threat Center. Our Veeam Threat Center is through our Veeam1 web client. You can access this anywhere that has an HTML access to the Veeam1 server. So you can create coffee windows, but this is the base window. When you first log in, you can see your successful jobs. I can see my cloud instances down here. If you have resource location tags to all of your machines, you can see around the globe all of the machines that are protected or are not protected if you have repositories offline and infected suspicious restore points. We can be configured to do periodic job runs to scan with an antivirus through CLI. And once that's been scanned, if there's something's flagged, our in-flight detection is flagged from the source of the backup, it's going to show up as an unhealthy region here. Our dashboards are configurable, and this is where you can start to share these out to stakeholders so that they only see a small portion of the environment that they may be responsible for. By default, this is the Veeam backup for Veeam backup and replication. You can see all of your repositories. You can know right away that red is bad. I know I have a bad job going on with my VMware environment. For some reason, the host have a DNS error. I can immediately go and start troubleshooting that. Heat map is also very nice because it gives you an overall health of your environment. I've seen organizations put this up on a central monitor or TV in the IT room, so every time you walk by, you can see this. If it's green, it's happy. If you start seeing yellows and oranges, this is something that you need to make a priority to start to address in your environment. From the same place, I have my Veeam backup for Microsoft 365. I can see my jobs, all of the repositories, how much data is going to that repository, and if it's gone up or down percentage-wise since the last time that I've been using it or sending data there. And then the overall protected users will say, hey, you may have users that are not within your backup that you should have within your backup, and you can check to make sure you're backing up all of those. Reports are another great way. There are many reports that you can configure to send throughout your day, every day, in order to get all of the insights in your environment. You can even have them send it weekly so that you have a weekly report on Monday when you come into your environments. And that takes us to kind of putting the pieces together.
It definitely does, because what's really great about all of this is obviously we've shown you elements of AWS and Azure and then pulling that back into the Veeam backup and replication piece. But the promise of that then means that you can have one centralized strategy for multi-cloud environments. And again, when we talk with organizations, that's coming up more and more. This idea that organizations are playing the cloud providers off of each other. They're, sometimes they're using AWS for platform as a service, but they find Azure VMs are more compatible with their environment. there's so many different reasons that multi-cloud is the reality. And at Veeam, we just want to make it easier to respond to the needs of your organization's infrastructure plan. So that's kind of what this sort of diagram is meant to show, is what is really the promise of doing all of this. Given that, you certainly are spending lots of time thinking about 2024 and what is going on with your specific infrastructure, or again, for the partners that are on the line, for your customers that you work with. So let's talk about some simple steps that you can take to make your clouds more resilient in 2024. The first we wanted to mention is just what Corinne showed earlier. What do you need to do in order to install these plugins? Now, I just included the description for the Azure plugin, but it's the same kind of setup for AWS and for Google Cloud. So all you need to do is go to the dedicated marketplace, so in this case, the Azure Marketplace, and you deploy the Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure appliance. You can then connect that to your Veeam Backup and Replication console by installing the Cloud plugin for Veeam Backup and Replication. So all of that is simple wizard-driven steps to execute those kinds of components to add cloud into your environments. So that's really the first step, is getting all this set up. And then let's talk about a couple of best practices. So the next thing we want you to do on the next slide is really think about the principle of least privilege. We definitely spent a lot of time talking about this here at Veeam, this idea that if we're going to be encouraging teaming, bringing everybody together, you really need to think about a zero trust security strategy. So how are you giving people the least amount of access needed to manage the environments? So by using things like identity and access management tools, and of course there's many out there, including Microsoft Azure AD, you can then delegate secure access using role-based access controls within Veeam. And of course, we recommend turning on multi-factor authentication. With the new 12.1 within the Threat Center, you also get some of these kinds of reminders. So if you don't have MFA turned on at different parts of your environment, it will alert you of that. It will shame you. It will tell you that you need to turn these things on. So these are great best practices that you can kind of implement across the different teams. A big one that we talked about before, if we can go to the next slide, is this idea of logical separation or logical air gapping. So the idea of air gapping has existed on premises for a long time. So this idea that you have something on network and then off network, again, maybe tape is the way to go. But within the cloud, you have to introduce this separation. So by having a dedicated backup account, by creating backups from snapshots that you can put into that other account, put onto other media, it's going to introduce the resiliency that you and your organization need to recover in the face of an attack. So if we take this one step further, Corinne, and go to the next slide, we really want to encourage everybody to make your ransomware recovery plans. And obviously, what we've been espousing this whole time is building a recovery plan for all of your workloads, regardless of where that data resides. But when it comes to the cloud specifically, really making sure that everybody knows exactly what to do in order to create a new account. So again, if that's AWS, you're creating a new AWS account. If it's Azure, you're creating that Azure subscription. And then using Veeam to pull those backups that live in immutable object storage and pushing them into that new account. And oh, by the way, if you've connected everything to your VBR server, you can then use secure restore to scan those backups. Make sure that they aren't affected. Of course, it should be implied when it's immutable storage, but always good for that extra step. And then point them to that brand new account and you're good to go. This should be the easy part. Recovery from ransomware should be the easy part. There's so many other big bad wolves that exist in cybersecurity. We want to kind of take this part of it out of the equation and make it a given so that you and your teams can focus on the other aspects of incident response. I know I blew through those kind of fast. Corinne, is there anything you want to go back through and add before we get to questions?
I think you very well covered it. It's a great call to action if you're not sure where to start. Afterwards, those four sectors will get you well on your way in having a more resilient 2024.
Absolutely. And speaking of that ransomware response plan, we do have lots of really great insights in a report that we just recently published this quarter called Cyber Resiliency for the Hybrid Cloud. Several of the data points that we featured here and many more are included in this report. So if you don't want to go and download all 3 of the research reports that we just talked about, you can go to this dedicated report and learn more about this dedicated security story specifically. Now, just to kind of call out a couple of questions that have come in, one of the questions that we did have from Edwin, how can Veeam support urgent and full systems recovery when a ransomware event occurs? Now, as a Veeam team, we actually spent a lot of time talking about this, that when you're building your ransomware recovery plan, literally document all of the tech support teams that you have to call for all the different vendors that you might be managing. So in the case of the cloud, for example, you want to have it documented exactly what the phone number is to call for the Azure incident response team, for the AWS incident response team. Alert them immediately. They have protocols in place to help you, as does the Veeam team. Corinne, do you want to talk a little bit about that, of how our tech support teams might handle a ransomware attack?
So yes, on our side, a ransomware or any type of data loss scenario in any organization is automatically considered a tier 1 problem, meaning that we have a escalated incident response team in order to help you find the right documentation, get you the right connections to your repository, and how to react in the Veeam situation whenever needing to recover from that data, making sure you have integrity, doing stage restores, and anything else that your environment may need to do right now in order to continue with the highest business continuity as possible.
Awesome, Corinne. Thank you so much. I did get another question from George that I fully expected to get asked on this webinar. When is the latest version of Veeam available? The answer is today. Veeam Data Platform 12.1 or 23H2 is available as of today. So you can go to veeam.com and download the latest version. And there are a whole host of new offerings within the latest version, including support for proactive threat hunting, and integrations with SIM technologies, including a new partnership that we have with Sophos. So if you're using Sophos within your incident response teams today, I highly recommend checking out that new integration. Corinne, I think those were the big ones that I wanted to see. Oh, Wellington, thank you so much for the kind words. Appreciate it. Do you see any other questions that you might want to pull out, Corinne?
No, but as for the release, I do want to call out this is a massive release that it's
Huge.
not just, it just says it's 12.1, but it's 12. Awesome when it comes to
Yes.
security. So I have to put that out there. I mean, we introduced the Veeam AI. We introduced a whole plethora of everything that you saw on my screen today was 12.1. So if you're looking at this demo today being like, I don't have that on my side, that's because it just came out today. I spent the last 2.5 hours building my lab environment out for you guys to try to introduce the most amount of features to show on this webinar here, including newly and freshly installed Azure AWS instances.
Definitely. And if you want to hear more from others who have just done this install or who have been playing around with the beta, the RTM, the RC, all the different versions that have come out before this, go to our community hub. So that's community.veeam.com. That is the place where hardcore Veeam community users are hanging out. They're chatting more about what's happening with the latest releases, and they're helping each other out. So I think a lot of what we talked about today is this idea of teaming, that it does take a village to pull everybody together. So I really recommend that you guys take a look at that community hub. It's a great place to get some help. Even if you just need a couch to cry on, there's definitely people there who can commiserate with any sort of pains that you have around security, budgeting, anything else you're going through. The community is a great place to help. I did get a question from Richard. Is this video available after the webinar? I should have put up a lovely housekeeping slide, so I'm sorry about that. We absolutely will be sending out an email of the recording and the slides after this presentation today. So keep an eye on your email for the next couple of days. And we should be off to the races with that. Corinne, any last words before we end?
No, I appreciate everyone that stuck it out with us to the end. You can always reach out to any one of your Veeam representatives or us if you have any further questions on any of these topics.
Fantastic. Well, with that, Thank you so much for everyone joining us. I know it's December, so this is oftentimes a time when everyone is traveling, heading home for the holidays, planning their 2024, dealing with last minute fires. So we really appreciate everyone joining us today. With that, thank you so much on behalf of the Veeam team, and we hope to see you on the next webinar. Thank you.